Hello. Okay, it's working.
Yes? All right.
So Dan, it's been a long journey. Last year we've been planning to meet, and finally we are here on stage. So talking of Dan, let me introduce you to a little bit about the story. A crowded train platform, a painful jolt to the arm, a mysterious fever, and a fortune in the balance. Welcome to a Calcutta murder so diabolical in planning and so cold in execution that it made headlines from London to Sydney to New York. Amarendra Chandra Pandey was a scion of a prominent zamindari family and heir to half the Pakur family estate. Benoyendra Chandra Pandey was a half-brother and he was heir to the other half. Their dispute became the germ for a crime that, with its elements of science, sex, and cinema, sent shockwaves across the British Raj. Working his way through archives and libraries, Dan Morrison has dug deep into trial records, police files, witness testimonies, and newspaper clippings to investigate what he calls the oldest of crimes, fratricide, which has been executed with utterly modern tools. He expertly plots every twist and turn of this repelling, yet riveting story, right up to the killer's cinematic last stand. Dan, it's such an intriguing and what an interesting book you've written. It never fails to surprise me. So let's start with the question that you've done such an incredible body of research for this, when you see the acknowledgements. So what was your research process as you have scanned archives across 3 continents and you have looked at memoirs and documents which were not available, which were restricted, and stuff which was also not printed? So how did you get the whole story together? How did you find the pieces and make the patchwork?
So there were, I think there are 3 elements of research for this sort of crazy, demented murder case. The one was just basically the trial record itself, which existed does exist in the British Library, where there's 1,000+ pages of the entire trial record that was donated to the library by the family of one of the High Court justices who heard the appeal. And so over the course of several years, whenever I would pass through London for work, I would steal some time, sometimes just even just a couple hours, to go to the British Library and to start photographing pages from this record. And at first I wasn't quite sure what I had, so I would take random samples of testimony just to see what caught my eye, to see what seemed, to see what the narrative might be. So that was one element, just the purely official element. The second was the newspaper clippings and how it was covered and received at the time. Now, newspaper clippings are good, but they're, as I know as well as anyone, it's the first draft of history. And so just because it's printed in the newspaper doesn't necessarily mean that it's firmly accurate to what happened, right? It's a recounting of what someone else has said at a trial at a time when the journalistic standards were a little different than they are today. And the third element was a mostly fruitless search for the writings, the letters, the journals of people who participated in this murder case, or who were adjacent to those who participated in it. And that's a real challenge when you're 80 years out from an event, and you have a large sort of diaspora culture here, where families are moving. They're the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of a lot of the participants in this case, the remnants are they're in Scotland or they're in the US. It's very hard to find, for families to track down, the letters of their grandmother or the journal of their great-grandfather. And this applied as well in the UK, where I used probate records and wills to find the descendants of some of the police officials and others who were involved in this case. And their grandchildren and great-grandchildren as well had no idea where most of it was. But I was able to scrape up 2 unpublished memoirs by the wives, the wife of the Calcutta police commissioner and the wife of the detective department chief, the head of the detective department.
Isabel Colson. Isabel Colson.
Was it Isabel Colson? It was Isabel Colson, excuse me. Isabel Colson and Henry LeBrock's wife as well. She typed up a memoir, and Henry himself had some stray writings that were on microfilm in the British Library. So that's where you get the real human touch is from people, recalling these events in their own voice and in real time. But it's by far the most difficult element.
That's so incredible. So the investigation trajectory defies reality. So this guy died, he was killed or whatever, he just died. And then the FIR is filed quite a considerable time after he was cremated. Imagine 1937. And then this one wily lawyer, Kalicharan Gupta, takes up the case on a whim, and then the search for evidence is conducted over Kolkata, Pakur, and Bombay. And Dan talks so eloquently about the Calcutta Detective Department, second paragraph of page 155. So he will talk about the investigation trajectory a bit, since we were talking about it before, and just read that little paragraph from page 155.
Sure.
And I think, it does poetic justice to my city. So it's a must that everyone hears what he's written.
Hold on. So we're talking about 1933 here. The detective department had over 60 Muslim and Hindu officers, men of diverse talents who were at home in any setting, from gambling den to lecture hall. The busy roster included writers and poets and a trained Maulvi. Their individual dress ranged from suit and bow tie to kurta and dhoti. Some of the bloodhounds went bareheaded, others wore takia or fez. A few were built like wrestlers, and some were thin as apprenticed clerks. In the variety of crimes he faced, the high and low cultures he inhabited, and the humid grandeur of Calcutta, a detective at Lal Bazaar, arguably, had the best police job on earth, topping his counterparts in London, New York, Istanbul, and even Bombay. Each man was a prince of the city, with unique freedom of movement and inquiry.
So that's how it was. The detective department was better than the ones in London, Istanbul, and Paris. So they warmed the cockles of my heart, Dan, to know that something in Calcutta was so superlative. So you tell us about the investigation trajectory a bit?
Sure. What you have is the oldest crime, which is fratricide, and for the oldest reason, which is over land, right? And brothers have been killing each other over land, for as long as we've been recording the existence of brothers. The setting is a place called Pakur in the Santal Parganas, in what is now Jharkhand. And the Pakur Raj is a hereditary fiefdom roughly the size of metropolitan London or the greater New York City area today in terms of the size. It's an old family that they attained their title from the Emperor Akbar, and for all the intervening centuries, this clan have been living the zamindari life, which essentially involves squeezing rents and taxes out of, a hard-pressed peasantry, kicking what they must up to the whatever supernal power they have. That's first the Mughals, and then, the Murshidabad. What were they called? I've forgotten.
Nawabs. The
Nawabs of Murshidabad, excuse me, and then eventually to the British. And you reach a point at which the last patriarch has died, and he's left this to his two sons, who are half-brothers. The elder is sort of a towering, broad-shouldered, extremely handsome, preternaturally calm, and extremely predatory figure. And the younger brother is thin and dutiful and not terribly exciting, but he's in the way. And so he chooses to remove this obstacle to his further enrichment. He chooses not to have his brother murdered in a hunting accident or have him beaten to death by gundas. He chooses to use microbes in the hope that if the boy just dies, then he'll be cremated, on the day of his death, and no one will ask us. No one will say anything about it. This is a period before antibiotics. This is a period where even the best treatments for the diseases that have historically decimated humanity, anyone could fall victim. In this, it's sort of hazy and damp right now, but this is a humid littoral, environment, and the rich and the poor alike just died of disease willy-nilly well into the 1940s here. And so it was a good plan that almost worked.
Okay, so that was a good plan that almost worked, and then I think you need to read the book
Yeah.
to find out how the Kalicharan Gupta doggedly pursued it. And the most incredible part was that he recognized this guy on a train and he called up the Calcutta Police Department and they arrested him in Asansol, if you please, on the train. And that's how efficient they were. He sent some sort of a telegram and they arrested him. And, it's very fascinating. So, again, when we're talking of investigation, so the book has incredible details of virology, immunology, epidemiology. The very short description, there's one chapter which gives us a very, very good idea of how the viruses originated and where they went and who treated them. And he's explained not so ordinary facts also. And this huge body of work when he talks of the zamindari caste system, the independence movement which is woven in, the immunology, the court case that happened. And he'll tell you how many words it was, and he's condensed it to 220 pages, which is a page turner. Trust me. So I would like you to talk about this, and also, since we're on the topic, maybe some sort of an advice to researchers and writers as to how they can, work around this before we come to the other topics.
So
First
you mean to just talk about the breadth of it, or what?
Breadth of it.
The breadth of it. So you have the spine, which is this really nutty murder case, and then the challenge is to take something that's just that it has the potential to be a one-hit wonder, right? Oh, look at this weird thing that happened. So the real challenge is recreating the world in which that occurred. And 1930s Cal is just an extraordinary setting, and one that, at least in English writing, to me appears to be sort of underexploited. The horrors of the First World War are over, and it's sort of a moment that's sort of on a precipice between mustard gas on one hand and partition and the atomic bomb on the other. It's a world where, they called this the crime of the century, because the real crimes of the century hadn't yet happened. They're just a few years away, and no one is aware of it. Nehru is makes an appearance in the book, and he doesn't know what's to come. He doesn't know that just barely more than a decade later that he'll be prime minister of an independent India. The British authorities have no idea about what they're about to lose. Right? Everyone is in a way innocent of what's to come, and so that, to me, is the, in addition to a good, insane, grisly crime, that's what made the writing so pleasurable, was to learn about this world and to, as best I could, recreate it in a way that, that didn't do it injustice and also that didn't embarrass myself.
Perfect. So when we're on the topic of talking about the world and the independence, he's chosen small nuggets of history, but they're very, very well meshed with the book. And I'd like to just ask you now, how did you nail the cultural ethos of Calcutta, which there's such fascinating vignettes, and it feels like Calcutta back there. And the pre-1947 India in Calcutta in the Alipur jail, the zamindari system, widowhood, of how the widows lived and the restrictions imposed on them. And you bring alive a sepia-tinted world so colorfully. So just to read a line from there, the taxi wove a path through Calcutta's thick lifeblood of plodding ox carts, horse-drawn tongas, diesel lorries, tram cars, and man-pulled rickshaws. Do tell us about how you got such a correct description of Calcutta. I mean, the feel is so local, I don't think any of us can find fault with it.
You really don't want anyone to find fault. You know, it's okay to get a fact wrong once in a while, but you do not want to get culture wrong when you're an outsider writing about someone else's world. It's a very high wire act. There are a lot of memoirs that are not necessarily the cinematic kind of memoirs that at least I hunger for. There's a lot of academic writing about that period, but not a lot of popular writing or general writing that I've been able to find. So you take it where you can find it, and that's often in memoirs. You know, Satyajit Ray, you know, he appears in the book. One of his school teachers was on the jury, and you know, even though he was sworn to secrecy, would return to school 3 days a week and tell these little boys every grisly detail of what had transpired in the court that day. Similarly, when talking about cinema and the early days of Indian cinema, again, another Ray memoir plays into that. So you look into people. I found in the writings that were not specifically intended to be a snapshot of a time and a place, that you can strip off little pieces of bark and weave something out of that. That's what I would say.
Oh, what a beautiful tapestry woven. And it's so Calcutta, and I don't think Calcutta can leave that description. So when you spoke about cinema, Dan talks extensively about cinema, Hollywood, and Sherlock Holmes, and the huge influence they had on society. So do you think that inspired the murders?
So
Talk a little more about it.
You got it. The killer in this case is, while he's a villain straight out of central casting in his lack of remorse and his confidence and, you know, his ease at lying and his skills as an inveigler. He's also to my mind, a very 20th century figure, a very modern figure, when everyone around him is still essentially rooted in the Victorian era. And what he's trying to do is reinvent himself. He needs all the money because he wants to reach some sort of escape velocity from his life as a zamindar and become a film producer and be a new man at a time when, you know, even in most cultures around the world, you could not escape who you were born as, right? He's looking for a form of reinvention, and that's through the cinema, and the modern aspect continues through his use of microbiology as a murder weapon. The inspiration for the use of microbiology as a murder weapon is very clearly, to me, a Sherlock Holmes story, the adventure of the dying detective, in which a wealthy planter is murdered in London by his uncle after receiving a sort of a decorative gift box, that when he slides open this box, a spring, the sharpened point of a spring pops out and jabs his thumb, and the young man is dead in 4 days. While in the Sherlock Holmes story, the ailment that kills this wealthy planter is not named, the symptoms align very closely with the symptoms of septicemic plague, and even to the point that in the story, the victim of that Sherlock Holmes story survives for 4 days before dying. And throughout the third plague pandemic, which sort of ravaged India from 1898 well into the 1950s, at the the hottest point of that pandemic, the average lifespan of a victim was 4 days. Sherlock Holmes was, of course, not Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle was, of course, a trained physician, and would have been aware of the medical literature of the day. So, not only was the manner of the homicide clearly, to me at least, inspired by this book, by this story, but I think as well the real mode, that is to say, plague as the murder weapon, I think also came from Sherlock Holmes. Which leads to the question of, do I know that he read the story? I don't know that he read the story. Sherlock Holmes was, as now, wildly popular in India, starting from almost the earliest publication, and more importantly, our killer was a film fanatic, and there's testimony from his driver that literally every other day he was at the movies. He was watching silent films, or he was watching
pornography.
He was watching the talkies.
Purna cinema.
And there were 2 adaptations of The Adventure of the Dying Detective that were shown in India, including one that appears
during that time.
Right about a year before the murder occurs. So the chain is a very tight one, even without direct documentary proof.
Right. So another thing that fascinated me about his book and completely had me hooked are the titles of the chapters. So there's one called Chhota Peg. There is a viper's tooth, if you please. And this is a Latin thing, cito longe tarde, which means leave quickly, go far away, and come back slowly. And many other very, very interesting things which are very culturally, connected with our, city and life and Bengaliness. And so I would like you to talk about that process, about how you thought of the names and why. The names are almost as interesting as the book.
I'm a newspaper man. You need a good headline, and that's what I was. You want to boil it down in a way that that makes someone want to keep going and keep reading. That's the best I can say.
It was.
Oh, good.
So before we come to one last question, which I'm going to ask you, is there anything else you want to say about the book? Okay, so I'll ask you this. So there are 2 books he's written. One is called The Black Nile and The Poisoner of Bengal. And The Black Nile was determined. He researched it, he wrote the book. But The Poisoner of Bengal was an accidental book, which happened while he was researching the Ganga. So what interested me was the fact that he chose 2 river systems, the Nile and then the Ganges. And then this murder happened along the Ganges, and then he got totally detracted. And then he started working on The Poisoner of Bengal. And can you tell us the background and how it happened and what inspired you to write this book, actually the background?
So my origins as a writer is as a crime reporter in New York. That's how I got my start. And then eventually I started doing international reporting, which involved not war, but a lot of post-conflict situations, but also cultural topics. And then I moved into more covering the environment and science and the history of science. While researching the Ganges River, everyone talks about this, the X factor of the Ganga, right? The mystery healing factor of the Ganga. And there are various theories about what was the scientific basis for this quality. And while looking into that, I was diverted into cholera and plague, and then was diverted, and stumbled upon on a small little newspaper clipping this murder case. And
that was the New York Times.
It wasn't even the Times story then. It was a small foreign paper. I was doing research at the Irish National Library of all places, and it mentioned I was looking for information on a man called Waldemar Hafkin, who's sort of this great scientific hero who created the first vaccines for cholera and plague and tested their safety on himself both times, as he made himself the test subject to be sure that it was safe. So while researching Hafkin, who came to India, I found this little clipping that said that the plague used to kill the boy had come from the Hafkin Institute, which was, after he retired, his laboratory in Bombay was named for him. And that pivoted me, utterly, because it was a perfect marriage of my origin as a cop reporter, essentially, and my later pursuits looking into the history of medicine. And here you have sort of a delicious collision of both.
That sounds quite incredible. So I'd like to know how many pages of research material did you have? And condensed to 220 pages of this. I know how many you had, so I'd like you to tell them.
Well, I mean, you just have to keep going. This took many years, and I did other work in between. But you just have to keep looking. There's always another place to look. When you're researching a topic, and then you're ingesting an ocean, and then you have to produce that cupful. In this case, I had the assistance of a very good editor, Anjali Puri at Juggernaut, who I gave her too much, and I knew I gave her too much, but she really, you need it. You need an editor, and well, I'm an editor now, and I try to be merciless with the copy that I'm given, and she really pushed me to sacrifice things that I thought were neat and interesting, but that slowed the narrative down, in favor of a tight, strong narrative. Right? You've got to. Some people will say they write for themselves, and that's great for them. But I think you really have to write with the reader in mind, and you have to keep the narrative as the narrative must have primacy over anything else, and that's what we did here.
Right. So before I hand the questions over to the audience, I would like to add that Ruby Mashi, who's sitting in the first row, introduced us, and I think we're both grateful for that. And Ruby Mashi, would you like to ask the first question? Who's got the mic for the questions? No? No. I think she's too frail. So we would like questions from the audience, please. Anyone? Can we have the mic there? We have a lot of time. We finished very fast.
Narrative overall.
Thank you so much for the session. Really enjoyable. I enjoyed how well you have researched. I mean, not only about representing the culture well, you have given some details, as ma'am was talking about, which were fascinating. I mean, it's kind of difficult to find those details of the 19th century because the documents are not that easily available. So, really, thank you for that. The question that I was thinking about asking is that this particular story, I mean, like crime. Real life crime documentation or historical documentation is something that has been happening for over centuries. Why did you got hooked onto this particular story? Apart from the fact that this is obviously a very modern kind of a killing mechanism, biological weapon at that point in time, I understand. But was that the only reason, or something else which you found worthy enough to be turned into an account or to be turned into a historical documentation kind of a thing? So if you can give your answer.
I thought the killing was terrific, and so to speak, and but the killing in this particular milieu, in this historical time and place, is what made it worth telling for me, and particularly. To me, this clash between, a new kind of modernity and an old world. Like, there's an old world that's about to disappear, right? That, 80 years later, you can see around, and I'm sure you hear it in your family every other day. The lamentation of that lost old world, right? And so it's emblematic of that change, right? He's a terrifically selfish character, right, and he appears just at the beginning of a wave in which selfishness in both good and really bad ways becomes an ethic, right? Certainly coming out of my country, which is about, the self overall, right? And about, escaping the past and renewing yourself or remaking yourself. So that's what caught my eye with this.
Dan, firstly, congratulations for the book. It's really a big surprise to us. Somebody coming from the foreign shore is reminding us about a murder mystery in my city which happened in 1930. Congratulations for that. My question is that while building this entire thing, I mean, definitely it was a culmination of a huge testimonial evidences where you gone various archival documents and other things. What are the obstacles and disadvantages you found to rebuild a story of Calcutta of 1930 standing in 2024, which is extremely wrongly arranged, I must say? Instead of being this particular background is in Calcutta, do not you think that your job would have been much easier if this particular murder mystery would have been any European country or North American country? What exactly the obstacle as a foreign author you found while doing research of the book?
That's a good question.
Well, I mean, the first is simply ignorance, which is that I'm not an academic. I don't speak Bengali, and this is key. Is that somewhere out there is a trove. Maybe it's not a single trove. Somewhere out there must be a trail of evidence of how Bengali society, and not Bengali high society, not strictly a Bhadralok society, responded to this case. And I haven't been able to find it, and I don't have I just don't have the depth to access it wherever it does exist, right? So there's another version of this story, waiting to be told, which is how did the broader Bengali society respond to it? I've got English language sources and a couple Bengali sources, but there's just a whole nother world. What I've got are court records. I've got the newspapers of the day. Who were those publishers? Who were they writing for, right? So there's a counter archive somewhere, or that someone should be assembling. That I hope someone will assemble. Digitization of old sources of newspapers. There's one Indian newspaper that has been digitized. It's the Times of India, and it's the Bombay edition of the Times of India. Patrika, there was a project to digitize some copies of that, but through the British Library, but there was some technical issue. They're kind of unreadable. Yeah, it's unorganized. It's unreadable. They got in too late. I don't mean that the people who archived it did anything wrong. I just mean that time had passed, and nature and the water molecule had done its work, so that the stock that they had to scan was greatly reduced from. It's not consecutive, and it's not as deep as it could be. And again, even though that newspaper, it was born of Calcutta, a lot of the issues that were scanned are from, like the Allahabad edition, that sort of thing. So just a dearth of digital sources. I don't think there's a single Bengali newspaper that is digitized anywhere, not here, not in Germany, not in America, not in the UK.
Australia also, you accessed records in Australia. Sydney.
I did, right. So, but those were English language sources, right? It's and Indian newspapers. The Searchlight out of Patna, was a major newspaper for a while. That I had to find private archives or community archives, like divorced from the government, to find these old copies in search of it. So there are a lot of obstacles, but that's also what makes it worthwhile. If it was in London or New York, someone else would have got it. Someone else would have done the story already.
So what is interesting is, Dan, I'd like you to tell them about why Patna. I mean, that's a very interesting link with Patna. So he speaks, there are about 2 paragraphs, but it's so interesting. Tell them about the Patna and Bengal link.
Well, so Patna was a major, it was once a major city. It was a major center of learning, and it was a major, you had Patna University, which was considered, the Oxford of the East at one point. And our victim was a student at Patna University, at Patna College at that time. And they had, and this was the old Bihar. This is where Pakur there, the Pakur Raj was then part of Bihar.
And they were all together, Bihar, Bengal. They hadn't been partitioned yet.
Yeah, I can't remember when Bihar becomes Bihar and Orissa, but it's it's all in that same soup.
Okay.
So that's why. But
That's a Patna connection, which is quite brimming with academia and
Yes.
intellect.
Good evening. You may try looking up if Amrita Bajar Potrika or Jugantar, either of them, as in I'm not very sure, but any one of them has been digitized. Portions of, some of the editions have been digitized because I myself remember having gone through. So you can try that. Amrita Bajar Potrika or Jugantar.
Amrita Bajar I can find out for you.
No, I've done it. I've searched it.
Right.
I've searched it.
I'm sure he has.
The years of this murder were not digitized. I think that the paper stock was
There is no
was
other.
too deteriorated
Okay.
that they couldn't scan it.
I have 3 questions. I'm
Please.
sorry.
Okay.
The first one is, since you said that you are interested in the history of medicine, that is what you've been exploring. My question is there any comparable case in ancient history?
Or modern, actually.
Yes.
So there are in antiquity there is mention of the attempt to use disease weapon, but the the proof isn't really there. I think the first really documented case would come from North America during the British expansion into North America, when you have a fully documented case of during a sort of indigenous uprising. I don't know if you could. My nomenclature isn't correct, but the terminology is incorrect. Basically, you've got some Indian battles taking place in North America, and 3 emissaries come to a fort at what is now Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania in the U.S., and they're coming to parley to try to persuade the British to fall back and leave them to their lands. And on the way out, they're presented with gifts, and the gifts are blankets. And these blankets are coming from the smallpox ward inside the fort, and there's pure documentary proof for that, because there's a ledger where they basically put out a purchase order for 3 more blankets, and they have to explain where these 3 blankets went, and they were taken from the smallpox ward and handed to these 3 emissaries of the Delaware nation, and then there's a smallpox outbreak among the Delaware nation. However, it is not proven that outbreak came from the blankets. The Delaware had raided a village, an English settler village, where many of the people themselves had smallpox, and so that was also possibly where it began. But the effort and the intent, I think that is the first truly documented case of intent. In the early days of the Black Plague, on the Black Sea, there's a Genoan outpost that the Mongols have laid siege to, and there are tales of, the bodies of the plague dead being catapulted either into the city or out of the city, but that's not really how plague is spread. They didn't know that at the time. So there you have some kind of effort, but it surely wasn't a factor in plague at that outpost. That but they wanted to do it. They just couldn't.
Thank you for that. My second question is, we know about Agatha Christie, how she was inspired.
Just a minute, just ask both the questions, so if you can intertwine it and answer it, it'll be quicker.
All right. The remaining questions are, Agatha Christie was inspired to write her first novel, I believe, based on a case that happened again in Kolkata, a murder, a closed room mystery. that happened, I believe, in Kolkata. Yes, the mysterious affair at Styles was inspired by a real-life murder case that took place, a murder that took place in Kolkata. So, in a similar way, was any work inspired? Was any work of fiction inspired by this case?
Pakur murder case and
by the Pakur case. And the last one is, we know that Calcutta is famously considered to be the first place where the Bureau for Fingerprint Examination was established in the 19th century, late 19th century. So did that play any role at any point, that is examination of fingerprints in this case? So that's the last question.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Agatha Christie, I'm not aware, though I read her stories as a child, I'm not aware of the one that you're talking about. But she was a member of the Society of the Apothecaries in London, in which she basically learned the art of poisoning, among other things. Yes. Yeah. Fingerprints were not a factor in this case. The factor in this case is the work of one lawyer who is sort of the physical and moral opposite of our cinematic villain. He's a small, nebbishy, he wears spectacles, he was a math whiz at Calcutta University, and yet when everyone around him is paralyzed with sort of fear and indecision about what to do about the death of Amarendra, he takes it upon himself to basically shoe leather it out, and he solves the crime. He hands it wrapped in a bow to the Calcutta police, who follow up his leads and they get more. But he's the only, aside from the killer, he's the only true active verb among the milieu of the rural gentry from which they came. So this one man, Kalidas Gupta, he's had it. He's had this. The villain has misused him in some way as a lawyer. He's lied to him and persuaded him to do something that turned out to be unethical. Like, he didn't know it was unethical. He didn't know that he'd been used wrongly. And when he learns he's been used wrongly, he flips. And he'll never look upon the villain in the same way. So when the villain's brother dies, he knows that he knows it's murder, and he runs it down. So there was no need for those sorts of for fingerprints. And when it comes to forensics, they were not yet trained in how to assess scientific evidence, and so you have something that would be unthinkable today in a criminal trial, where the prosecution and defense witnesses, who are experts in their field, are called upon to testify about other aspects of science while they're also on the stand. So the doctor who identifies plague as the germ that killed the boy is also asked about tetanus and other things. It was just too early in. Science had not yet really seeped into criminal justice in the same way that it has today.
And talking of the inspiration from this murder, your last chapter.
Oh, yes. So fiction. There are two. I would say there are two fictional treatments. One is maybe intentionally fictitious. There's what is his name? Charan Chandu, the jailer. Who's the author who wrote all the jail memoirs in Bengal?
I forgot.
Chara Chandu. Okay.
He gets a mention in the book.
Yeah, Chara Chandu Chakrabarti. Okay, so Chara Chandu Chakrabarti
Thanks, Shaunak.
is a young jailer when Benoyendra Chandra Pandey is first imprisoned in Alipur jail, and decades later he writes about him, and it's one of the few first-person accounts of the killer, and he writes of his beauty and his nobility, and also how he was one of the few true criminals that he'd ever found behind bars. But he gets all the details of the murder case wrong. So maybe it's just poor memory, or who knows. So that you could call that a fictional treatment of it. But in the 1960s, a film is made broadly taken off of the Pakur murder case that turns the Pakur murder case, which is simply about greed and amorality, and turns it into a sort of social commentary in which the character of Benoyendra becomes a remorseful, tortured figure whose mother was a courtesan who was mistreated, that sort of thing. It's a lovely, it's got the 60s and early 70s, just before black and white went kaput, these sort of luscious, luminous films. Rajwansha, yeah. So it did. He always wanted to be in the films, and then finally, 20, 30 years after his death, he becomes the hero that he always wanted to be and never really was.
Any more?
Dan, I don't need a mic for this one, but are you working on another true crime book?
I'm working on a bigger project that involves it involves a wholesale sex trafficking from Europe to the Western Hemisphere in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it's just kind of vast, and so it'll take a lot longer. This was tidy.
Any other questions? Anyone? Would you like to ask Dan anything? So I think we can wrap this up. And Dan, this was really amazing. And just by the way, he covered Trump's elections in DC till some time back. And tomorrow he's talking on the Voting Inc. with Rajiv Sardesai. So I think that will be very, very interesting. Because the short interludes we had on WhatsApp while the elections were going on were very interesting. And Modi was being elected here, so parallelly. No, not at all, not at all. And thank you so much, Dan. And thank you, all of you, for being here and having sacrificed some major event in that other big Shamiana. I think this was well deserved. No, come on. And switch off the camera for that. Yeah, that's because the writer. That's because the writer.
Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it.
And it is so Indian.
Just let me say one more thing. The reason it's written by a foreigner is because the trial record, the High Court judge took his copy home with him, and eventually his descendants donated it to the British Library, where anyone can get a library card and see anything, right? It's this high level of accessibility, right? While the copy that was left here in the High Court was checked out by a prominent attorney. I'm told this. I don't know this for a fact. I'm told this by a friend of mine. And he never returned it. So this was taken out of the High Court in the 1990s. It was never returned. And so has denied for 30 years Indian researchers the opportunity to plumb the case, right? Where I had the privilege of having a job that had me traveling a lot, so I could pop into London from time to time and start mining it, right? That's not a privilege that a lot of people have.
It's not a book by Dan Morrison, but Dinobandhu Mitro. I mean, there's no Americanism in the book at all. It's so Indian in character and so much Calcutta, and which is what floored me with the book. Yes, totally. Accidentally lucky. So, thank you so much, Dan. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. I just leave it.
Hello.
Just carry on for your dinner.
Thank you. Hello, check.